At night in the old quarters of Rome, it is not prayers that live longest, but whispers. At the doors of basilicas and at crossroads, you can still hear the story of how a pontiff once walked these streets in full regalia, and beneath the white robes was not an old cleric, but a pregnant woman. In the legend, she falls during the procession, her robe tears, the crowd sees blood and a child, and with them, the deception that supposedly managed to penetrate the throne of St. Peter. The place of the fall is pointed out, called the most shameful spot in the city, although the stones there are no longer the same, and the houses have long been rebuilt. I welcome everyone who is listening to this analysis. Please write in the comments which city and country you are from, and where you first encountered this legend, in a film, novel, memes, or a serious book. I wish you a peaceful but attentive listening experience. Next, we will look not at the spicy story, but at how the plot about the alleged female pope became a tool in the political struggle against Rome, and why it lives on in the archives quite differently from how it is remembered orally. If we boil the legend down to its bare bones, it looks like this. An adult woman, supposedly very educated, dresses in men's clothing, goes by a false name, and rises from a wandering cleric to a learned theologian, then to a cardinal, and finally to the elected pope. For years, she lives surrounded by clerics, conducts services, signs documents, and receives ambassadors. All this time, she is accompanied by a male companion whom sources refer to in different ways, sometimes as an assistant, sometimes as a lover. At some point, she becomes pregnant, hides it under heavy clothing, and continues to participate in ceremonies until, during a solemn procession, contractions cause her to fall in the middle of the street. The crowd realizes that they are not looking at the Holy Father, but at a woman who has violated both the sexual order and her vow of chastity. Further accounts tell of stoning, others of imprisonment, and still others that the section of road is permanently closed to processions. On an emotional level, this story is perfectly constructed. It strikes several sensitive points at once: fear of the female body in male power, hatred of lies at the top, suspicion of the luxury and secrecy of the curia. For the average townsperson, this is a convenient parable. If even the papal throne was once deceived by a woman in a cassock, then the church is fundamentally untrustworthy. But as soon as we move away from retellings and turn to documents, the foundation of the legend disappears abruptly. The official lists of pontiffs kept by Roman clerks are arranged by year and name without a single gap where a woman could be inserted. Between the popes among whom chroniclers later place the popis, there are no gaps in the records, no strange interruptions, no mention of a ruler of dubious origin. The papal bulls of that time are neatly dated and signed. Male names, usual formulas. No female names disguised as Latin forms were found in the signatures. There are also no church investigation records that would indirectly confirm a scandal of this magnitude. In other words, where we would expect to find traces of a monstrous event, such as a pregnant pontiffess on the street. The archives are silent. The first written versions of the legend appear only several centuries after the alleged events. In the 13th century, a northern European chronicler of the Dominican circle inserts an episode in a short note stating that between two real popes there was allegedly someone who turned out to be a woman. He writes about this in a vague manner, referring not to documents, but to stories. A generation later, another more famous author repeats the story, but expands on it. He adds the name of John, indicates her origin from Germanic or British lands, describes the route of the procession, and invents the violent reaction of the crowd. The plot grows not from the acts of the conclave, but from rewriting each other, as is often the case with urban legends. If we trace the manuscript tradition, we can see how the myth is literally woven into the text. In some lists, the story of the female pope appears as an insert between entries about wars and famine. In others, it is written in the margins or omitted. Sometimes a later hand underlines it, as if in agreement. That's what the old people said. Sometimes, on the contrary, it is crossed out, leaving a blank space. For historians, this is a key signal. What we have before us is not an event recorded by everyone, but a floating piece of folklore that some copyists considered worthy of mention, while others considered it dangerous or shameful. The real Roman context on which the myth tries to rely looks much rougher. The papal court of that time was a dense, noisy organism. Dozens of adult male clerics, servants, scribes, guards, doctors, and cooks in cramped quarters. Candidates were not vetted through theatrical inspections, but rather through their origins, patronage, education, and reputation. Any oddity in a candidate's biography would quickly become a weapon in the hands of their opponents. The idea that a woman could hide her pregnancy and gender for years among people who depended on rumors and denunciations is inconsistent with the reality of survival at court. At the same time, the legend stubbornly attaches itself to the stone and the root. Later, guidebooks point to a specific narrow street and explain that papal processions allegedly bypass it because of an old disgrace. City records explain the change in routes differently. Construction hazards, political conflicts, sanitary considerations. But for the mass consciousness, the version about a forbidden place where a terrible secret was once revealed is much more interesting. Thus, the myth takes over the real space, even if the city has long since changed. The way the female body is used in the story is also important. In the legend, it not only breaks the rule of a man on the throne, but also becomes a platform for public punishment. Pregnancy, labor, fall, death, all this is often retold in a deliberately crude and humiliating manner, although sources that speak of real executions or mob violence in Rome are usually much more restrained in their details. This discrepancy is another sign. What we have here is not a protocol, but a moral picture designed to evoke disgust, both for the woman herself and for the system she allegedly deceived. Then, the crises of the papacy come into play. Every time the church plunges into anti-papacy, schisms, and rivalry between competing courts, the legend of the female pope resurfaces as a convenient example. A preacher, criticizing the curia, reminds his listeners that Rome has already allegedly allowed a monstrous fall, a woman on the throne, and therefore the current abuses are not surprising. A university master uses history as a hypothetical example in a debate about whether the power of the sacraments depends on the dignity of the priest. A political opponent of Rome hints, if the system once failed to notice a woman under the tiara, why should it be trusted now when it declares someone to be the legitimate or illegitimate pope? Step by step, a paradoxical picture emerges. In the myth, there is a supposedly proven scandal involving a pregnant pontifessa dying on the streets of Rome. In the document, there is not a single official trace, only later chronicles, field notes, polemical texts, where history serves as a convenient illustration. This legend becomes a kind of blueprint. It is brought up from memory whenever it is necessary to strike at the authority of Rome, and then put back into the shadows when the political climate changes. And that is precisely why one day the Church will have to respond not only with theological arguments, but also with cold paper, lists of legitimate popes, lists of elections, an attempt to close the gap that has been created over the centuries, not by documents, but by persistent urban whispers. If we move away from street stories and open the parchment, the first thing that catches the eye is not scandal, but emptiness. In the official lists of Roman bishops, which stretch back to late antiquity, there is simply no room for the era in which Pope John is usually placed. One pope died, another was elected, and between them there are letters, council acts, imperial documents, and coins with their names. There is no woman hiding under a man's name in these series. To insert her into the 9th century, it would be necessary to remove a real pontiff or invent a secret reign unprecedented in history, without a single document. This is the first stark discrepancy between legend and document. The urban legend promises a loud scandal, but the archives remain silent, as if nothing of the sort had ever happened. The earliest written traces of the story of the female pope appear not in official records, but in late medieval collections of examples for preachers. In the mid-13th century, the Dominican Jean de Meaux included a short episode in his collection. A certain person who ascended to the papal throne turned out to be a woman when she went into labor during a procession. There is no name, no date. Everything is presented as a lesson about pride and deception. Around the same time, Etienne de Bourbon uses a similar plot in his treatise on spiritual gifts. God allegedly allows a woman dressed as a man to rise to the top of the hierarchy and then publicly exposes her. In both cases, the story serves as an illustration for a sermon, not the result of archival research. It is a convenient horror story that can be told in any village. The critical moment comes with the appearance of the legend in the Chronicle of Popes and Emperors by Martino Polono, Martin of Opava. He was a cleric associated with the Curia. His chronicle became a popular reference work. In a single text, the reader is given the entire line of popes, emperors, and major events. In some manuscripts, after one of the real Johns, there is an insertion about a certain John Anglic, who was actually a woman. Allegedly from Germany, he studied, became famous for his learning, was elected, and during a procession along a certain street, he gave birth to a child and died. The chronicler adds a motif about bypassing this place because of the shame. For a 13th century reader, this sounds convincing. If it is written in a well-known chronicle, then it must be true. But when checking the manuscripts, it is clear that the episode is not present everywhere, sometimes clearly added by another hand in the margins. This is a sign of a later insertion, not evidence of an early tradition. If we go back to the 9th century, the picture becomes even clearer. For the supposed time of the pope-like figures, we have not only catalogues of names, but also dated letters, decisions of councils, imperial decrees, and records of the appointment of bishops. The Book of Pontiffs, compiled in Rome, although inaccurate in detail, records the sequence. One pontiff dies, another takes office, with no unusual gaps. German and Italian chroniclers describe the intervention of the Carolingian court, disputes with Constantinople, local church conflicts, but they know nothing about a pregnant woman in a tiara. If a public scandal involving childbirth during a procession had occurred in Rome, it would inevitably have been recorded in at least one independent source. The absence of even indirect references by contemporaries is a strong argument against the historicity of the story. But the legend lives on not in the archives, but in the city's memory. In late medieval guidebooks for pilgrims to Rome, there appears the place where the woman pope gave birth, a section of the street between the Lateran and the Colosseum, a column, a statue. The city profits from the flow of pilgrims, and such a black spot on the route becomes part of the commercial scenario. A pilgrim who comes once in a lifetime has no time to check the Book of Pontiffs. They listen to the story of a local guide who in one walk shows them both holy relics and the place of terrible shame. Thus, the legend is cemented in stone and gestures, although its roots lie in 13th century manuscripts, not in 9th century documents. If we look at the chronology, the emergence of the story about the Pope coincides with periods of crisis in papal power. The 13th and 14th centuries were a time of struggle between pontiffs and kings, disputes over taxes, trials against the Templars, and the Avignon captivity. Later, during the Schism, when there were several pretenders to the throne at the same time, the legend was used as an argument. Since the church had once managed to elect a woman, the institution itself was already compromised. Opponents of the next pope recalled the story of the shame of Rome to emphasize that the conclave's choice should not be trusted unconditionally, that external control, councils, and the participation of lay authorities were needed. In this logic, the myth became an instrument of political polemics. On the other hand, some church authors do not fight the legend at all, but carefully incorporate it into their own texts. Some chroniclers close to the Curia retell the story of the female pope as a strange episode, leaving the interpretation to the reader. For them, it is an opportunity to remind readers that God can allow extreme disgrace as punishment for the laxity and pride of the church elite. But even they do not support the story with references to authentic documents from the early period. They simply repeat the story that is already circulating. Thus, the legend becomes part of the internal self-punishment of the church, but does not become a recognized fact. When universities join the discussion, the tone changes. Late medieval theologians and canonists, in debates about papal infallibility and authority, occasionally cite Pope John as an example of the institution's monstrous error. For some, this is a reason to demand the supremacy of councils over the papacy. For others, it is simply a striking illustration in a long lecture. None of them pull out a document from the archives confirming the existence of a female pope. They rely on the same chronicles of Martino Polono and Dominican collections of examples. History becomes a convenient token that can be moved from treatise to treatise. As a result, a mechanism familiar to history emerges. Where the document is dense, the myth recedes. Where the document is silent or difficult to access, the myth takes its place. The legend of the pregnant pontiffess, originated as a moralizing example in preaching books, was included in popular chronicles, acquired its own place in Rome, and became a weapon in the controversy over papal power. It was readily recalled in times of anti-popes and schisms, when it was necessary to explain a complex institutional crisis in a simple way, and almost never, even in university debates, was the boring but crucial question asked: where, among the dates and lists of real popes, could a place be found for her without destroying the entire chronology? And it was at this moment, when the first scholars began to cautiously write in the margins, "Some lists do not say so," that the Church faced a new type of crisis of confidence. In the late 15th and 16th centuries, it had to respond not only to accusations of luxury and violence, but also to a question that had rarely been asked before. Who exactly sat on the throne of Peter in each era? What was the line of succession? And were there any gaps or substitutions in it? At the councils, where the reform of the clergy's morals and the abuse of power were discussed, much less noticeable work was being done in parallel, organizing lists of popes, checking manuscripts, and verifying dates. Against the backdrop of disputes over dogma, this looks like dry accounting. But it is here that the legend of the papacy begins to interfere not only with Rome's reputation, but also with the structure of time through which the Church has become accustomed to telling its story. The reaction is expressed in the appearance of carefully verified catalogues of pontiffs. They are compiled in Rome and in large monasteries, based on papal archives, council acts, and letters. The chronology is built around events that have a clear date: the convening of an ecumenical council, the coronation of an emperor, the conclusion of a specific treaty. Between these reference points, the pontificates are spread out or shifted so that there are no extra years that could be attributed to the legendary woman. In some of these lists, the authors specifically state, "After such and such a pope immediately follows, and there can be no other figures between them, because the documents are filled out every year." This provides a practical, rather than just theological, defense against the myth. Instead of emotionally arguing with the story of a pregnant pontiff, they show a dense series of seals and dates where there is no room for her. This strategy is especially noticeable in responses to Protestant polemics. Where reformers cite Pope John as a vivid example of the fall of Rome, Catholic authors respond not with stories of miracles, but with pedantic tables. They show that in the years that legend traditionally attributes to the secret reign of a woman, in reality, there were very specific men who left behind letters, orders, and entries in notarial books. Sometimes apologists go even further and analyze the arguments of the legend's supporters point by point. They point out that no reliable catalogs mention her until a certain century, that the first appearance of the story coincides with the crises of the papacy and the struggle between Roman families, and that it was precisely then that anti-papal forces could have been interested in creating the most humiliating myth possible. Thus, the legend is placed for the first time in the context of political struggle, and not just in a series of edifying miracles. At the same time, the Church finds itself in a difficult position. By denying the reality of one of the most famous parables about itself, it risks increasing distrust of its other stories. Some Catholic theologians have to choose a strategy of cautious acknowledgement. They admit that there were different stories about Rome's past, that some chroniclers may have been mistaken or succumbed to rumors, but insist that the institution as a whole corrects such errors as knowledge accumulates. In this vein, the compilation of official lists of popes with detailed annotations is presented as a gesture of transparency. Theologians show which documents they rely on, thereby attempting to convince the educated reader that the line of succession is controlled not only by tradition, but also by the archives. These subtleties are invisible to the masses. For university circles, they mean more than just another sermon against pope-mongering. Meanwhile, in secular culture, the legend continues to live its own life, almost independent of church refutations. Writers and playwrights of the early modern period use the story of a woman on the papal throne as a ready-made plot device. Mystery, reincarnation, sudden exposure before the eyes of the crowd. In these versions, the myth finally breaks away from attempts to tie it to specific years or names. It becomes an allegory about the masks of power, the fragility of authority, and punishment for deception. At the same time, everyday details, clothing, processions, the roads of Rome, the reaction of the crowd, are described with a naturalistic detail that was not present in the first monastic storytellers. Fiction replaces chronicles in the eyes of those who learn about the past through plays and novels rather than Latin tables. For such readers, the dispute between document and myth is resolved in favor of what strikes the imagination more strongly. In the long run, however, the balance shifts. By the 18th and 19th centuries, professional historical science has developed, for which the verification of sources is not optional, but a basic skill. Researchers, armed with methods of textual criticism, began to systematically check papal lists, chronicle manuscripts, notarial books, and city archives. For them, the legend of the female pope proved to be a convenient testing ground. It could be used to show how a myth is born and becomes established if it is not stopped in its early stages. They demonstrate that early independent accounts of pontiffs make no mention of a female pope, that the sequence of names and dates leaves no room for her, and that even within the legend itself, there are internal contradictions in chronology and circumstances. In the works of such historians, Pope John moves from the category of doubtful but possible episodes to the section of urban legends, illustrative, high-profile, influential, but not confirmed by documents. However, even after this, the myth does not disappear. It simply changes its functionality. For anti-clerical authors of the 19th century, the Pope remains a convenient symbol of the Church's alleged ability to cover up any scandals. For early feminist writers, she sometimes becomes a dark irony, an imaginary figure of a woman who reached the pinnacle of power, but existed only as the fruit of others' fears and hatred. For historians, it is a reminder that without systematic verification, even the most absurd story can live on for centuries, embedded in sacred lists and political speeches. Thus, the circle is complete. A legend born as a crude parable about punished deception turns into a case study about dealing with the past, about how societies manipulate memory for the sake of control, and how the only antidote is boring-looking papers, which are so easy to lose out to in terms of spectacle, but without which history turns into a set of convenient fairy tales. And yet, the legend of the woman on the papal throne remains not only a text, but also a route through the city. Modern Roman guides tie her to a stone. They show the alley where the exposure allegedly took place, the house of mercy where the child was supposedly taken, and point to strange pieces of church furniture, declaring them to be traces of an old scandal. A person who can barely read can point to the pavement and say that it was here, according to the old people, that a woman hiding under white clothes collapsed during the procession. Blood, screams, and a shameful death are already being filled in by the imagination. The document remains silent, but the stone is included in the plot and works as an argument stronger than any archival list. The legend is especially eagerly associated with marble chairs with holes, which are credited with playing a role in verifying the sex of the future pontiff. In Stories for Pilgrims, this is presented as the Church's reaction to the humiliation it had experienced, as if, after the episode with the popes, the cardinals decided not to trust clothing alone anymore. Historical descriptions of ceremonies in earlier centuries do not record anything of the sort. They list the election, the acceptance of the ring, the cloak, and the throne, but no strange tests. The chairs themselves most likely originate from ancient life, associated with baths and amenities. In a city living among ruins, any unusual form becomes a screen for projection. Tour guides of the 18th and 19th centuries eagerly recount the deacon's whisper, supposedly confirming to everyone that the man before them is the Messiah, although there are no ritual acts describing this scene. Here, myth literally replaces the archive. Stone argues with the silence of papers and winds. This story clearly shows society's attitude toward the body of power. For believers, the Pope is not only a theologian and administrator, but also an aging man with illnesses, habits, and fears. In a world of plague, famine, and war, the stability of a structure presented as unshakable depends on his health. Against this backdrop, the story of how an inappropriate body was once hidden under the tiara is perceived as a violation of the established order. Even though the woman is described in the legend as educated and capable of deceiving the cardinals, she is symbolically transformed not into an alternative, but into the embodiment of failure. The possibility that her reign could have been successful is hardly considered. Attention is focused on the moment of exposure, on the fall and punishment through the functions of the body. For preachers, such a story is convenient as a warning. An attempt to go beyond the prescribed role turns into a public disaster. Therefore, in times of crisis, the legend resurfaces and changes along with the spirit of the times. During the Avignon papacy and the years of the Western Schism, when several claimants existed simultaneously, the papacy was spoken of as a long-standing sign that the church machine was capable of making monstrous mistakes and enthroning those who should not be there. During the Reformation, this image was reinforced. For opponents of Rome, the female figure on the throne of Peter was easily associated with apocalyptic images of the great whore. In treatises and sermons, the fall of a pregnant woman in a procession became a vivid image illustrating the thesis of the profound decay of the institution. What was a urban horror story for past generations became an element of theological and political polemics. The Catholic side is forced to mount a defense. Late 16th century theologians analyze the story point by point. They show that early catalogues of popes do not mention any woman on the throne, that the first texts mentioning popes appear many generations after the alleged event, and that the dates are adjusted to fit a preconceived legend. At the same time, the Church is betting on demonstratively cementing succession. Lists of pontiffs are created, galleries of portraits, frescoes, and mosaics are built, where each pope gets a place and a face. There are no women in these visual lines, and their absence is presented as a refutation of the myth. But the more densely the wall is filled with successive images, the more noticeable it becomes that such rows can be edited, which means that for some viewers, they become not proof, but another reason to suspect that official memory is hiding something. At the same time, the meaning of the figure of a woman in men's clothing is also changing. In the traditional order, the female body is rigidly tied to the home, to childbirth, to the cloistered life of a convent. The story of an adult woman entering the realm of male power and scholarship and remaining there for some time becomes both frightening and attractive. In popular retellings, she is punished through the same bodily functions. Pregnancy, childbirth, physical pain, and death under the oppressive crowd are presented as natural retribution for attempting to take someone else's place. This makes the story a convenient tool for enforcing discipline. It explains why women should stay within their designated boundaries, and those who try to learn or argue are threatened with the image of the Pope as a final warning. The documentary layer remains suspiciously empty. There are no interrogation records, notarial records of executions, or acts of posthumous condemnation of a certain woman who occupied Peter's throne. Instead, the archives contain other cases: trials against nuns accused of violating the statutes, protocols on heretical movements, where women often appear as prophetesses or healers, lists of punishments for violating the monastery fence and indecent behavior. Against this backdrop, the Papist seems like an exaggerated fantasy of a society that punishes living women daily for far less radical violations, but takes particular pleasure in stories about a too clever and ambitious sinner who reached the top and was therefore destroyed. With the advent of the printing press, commercial interest was added to this pattern. Cheap books of miracles and horror stories eagerly included episodes about the female pope alongside tales of bloody omens and demonic phenomena. Engravings showed the moment of her fall, the crowd, white robes, and black hoods all around. No one checked the stories against the Latin tables of pontiffs. What mattered was the dramatic effect and the chance to sell a few dozen more copies. The market economy reinforces the myth's vitality. Each generation receives its own visual version of the story without going to the archives. At universities, teachers can explain to students why the probability of the real existence of the anti-pope is negligible. But in the evening, these same people will retell the well-constructed legend to their friends in the tavern. It is in this gap between the document and the story that the real value of the story of Pope John manifests itself, not as evidence of a specific episode, but as a mirror in which we can see the fear of female subjectivity, distrust of closed institutions, and a willingness to replace boring lists of names with vivid, physical, shameful images. By the time audiences are already debating whether Pope John ever existed, the legend has taken on a life of its own, in taverns, cheap collections, and among city storytellers. In Rome, visitors are shown the place where the birth allegedly began. Preachers insert the story into a series of edifying examples. Opponents of the papacy use it as a heavy argument against Rome. For an institution that relies on the idea of unbroken male succession, this is not a harmless anecdote, but a constantly open wound. If you repeat long enough that once Rome failed to notice a woman in a tiara, then other claims to exclusivity can also be called into question. Over time, the Church's response becomes more organized. Catalogs of legitimate popes appear, lists of names and dates intended to fill the chronological gap through which the legend has crept in. In these lists, Joan is simply omitted, as if she had never existed. Silence becomes a form of defense. To acknowledge and directly refute means to give the fact under discussion status. It is easier to pour concrete. But this is precisely what is most convenient for opponents. Protestant polemicists and anti-Catholic authors of the early modern period gladly point to old chronicles where the popess still appears, and to later lists where she is no longer to be found, as an example of Rome allegedly rewriting its own past. A new twist comes with the criticism of sources. 17th and 18th century scholars compare manuscripts, check dates, and note that evidence of the popess appears several centuries after the alleged event, contradicts each other in terms of time and details, and is not confirmed by any official document. For church historians, the debunking of the legend is a significant victory. They are able to demonstrate how a late urban legend gains the appearance of fact. But even after this, the legend does not disappear, but simply changes status, from "it was" to "so they say." It begins to be discussed as a symptom of collective distrust of the papacy, as an indicator of what stories people were willing to invent about the distant center of power. The mass culture of the new era picks up the myth and rewrites it to suit its own needs. Novels, plays, and later films turn the papessa into either the embodiment of the shame of Rome or a figure of protest against a closed male structure. Historically, this has almost nothing to do with the original controversy, but it shows how closely linked the power of the Church and control over bodies are in the European imagination. Catholic authors respond dryly and technically. In reference books and official documents, they call the legend a late invention, unsupported by historical data, explain the symbolism of controversial rites, and try to separate the real ritual from popular fantasies about sex checks and secret trials. If we combine both layers, archival and legendary, a double story emerges. Documents know the papacy as a chain of male names, councils, schisms, and relocations. Myth adds to this chain an imaginary woman whose body allegedly destroyed the illusion of the system's infallibility right on the street. Every major crisis of confidence in Rome, the investiture controversy, Avignon, schisms, the Reformation, is accompanied by a surge of interest in this story. It concentrates the fear that a mistake could happen at the very center, and at the same time, the desire to humiliate the institution through the story of someone else's body. For historians, the conclusion is clear. From a documentary point of view, the popess is a late construct that served the polemic. But its longevity shows how important it was for Europeans to believe that any power, even sacralized power, could be struck at its most vulnerable point. Its reputation, built on control over the body and gender,